I'm Major Andrea Gutierrez, 32, and I earned my place in military operations through quiet grit and years of unrecognized work. For years, I supported my brother's career, editing his applications, covering his expenses, even cheering him on when no one noticed me. But when my own father introduced me at his promotion ceremony as the one who gave up, and my brother laughed, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been dismissed or humiliated by the very people you sacrificed for? If so, drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to reclaim your worth in silence, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories on boundaries, resilience, and becoming who they never saw coming. What happened next might just surprise you. My name is Andrea Gutierrez, and if you'd asked anyone in my family growing up, they would have told you I was the smart one, but not the strong one. Not in the way that counted to them. My dad, Commander Luis Gutierrez, spent 20 years in the Navy and still carried himself like he was reporting for duty every morning. My mom, a retired Army medic, was quieter about it, but no less shaped by service. Structure, obedience, discipline, that's what they lived by. That's what they expected. My older brother, Pablo, was the blueprint. 2 years ahead of me, same rigid jawline and buzz cut as Dad, same interest in war history, same comfort with being told what to do and when. From the time we were kids, it was obvious he was being groomed for something specific: military academies, honor codes, command potential. Dad used to bring him along to the base on weekends, let him sit in on officer briefings like he was an apprentice. I got dropped off at my aunt's house those days. I was different. Always had been. I liked puzzles, books, problem solving. I asked questions that made people uncomfortable. Why this rule? Why that standard? And it didn't win me many fans at the dinner table. I still remember being 12 and saying I wanted to study engineering and maybe apply to a Navy research unit someday. Dad looked at me over his coffee and said, "You don't have the temperament for it, Nat. You'd fall apart the first time someone barked an order." It wasn't said with cruelty. That was the worst part. He believed it completely. Still, I believed in the values, even if I didn't fit their mold. I believed in service and in the idea that strength could look like competence, like clarity under pressure, like making hard calls and not needing applause for it. I started training on my own at 15, running before school, practicing drills I found online, even shadowing a retired Navy pilot who lived down the street and took pity on the girl with too much to prove. I kept it quiet. My family wasn't interested, and I had stopped needing their approval out loud. When Pablo started his application process, I was the one who helped him write his essays. I revised them late into the night, made sure his resume hit the right keywords, even coached him on how to answer interview questions like a candidate and not just a teenager repeating Dad's catchphrases. He never really thanked me. Not properly. Just said, "Looks good," before submitting them. But he got in. Full officer track at Annapolis. My parents beamed like someone had handed them a trophy. "That's what focus and discipline get you," Dad said. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't have to. I didn't resent Pablo. Not exactly. He played the role he was assigned, and he did it well. But over time, it got harder to ignore how different the rules were for each of us. When he needed help with his prep courses, I tutored him. When he was between housing during a training rotation, I sent money without asking for it back. He never asked me how I was doing. Never offered to return the favor. And my parents, especially Dad, acted like none of it happened. Like Pablo was lifting himself by his bootstraps, and I was off somewhere being soft. The summer before I turned 20, Pablo came home on leave and brought one of his academy friends with him. I remember being in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner, when I overheard Dad in the other room, bragging. "She wanted to be Navy too, can you believe that?" Would have lasted 2 weeks before crying to come home. Not everyone's cut out for it. The other guy laughed. Pablo didn't say anything. Not one word in my defense. When I walked into the room, they got quiet. Dad looked at me like he'd been caught but didn't apologize. Just raised an eyebrow like, "See, this is what I mean." That night, I went back to my apartment and printed out the application packet for a civilian-to-officer commissioning program I'd been eyeing for months. I didn't tell anyone. Didn't ask for help. I submitted every document on my own, trained in silence, and when I got my interview date, I scheduled it between shifts at the emergency dispatch center I worked at part-time. Every question they asked, I answered without flinching. Why no? Because I'd been preparing for years. What motivates you? I said, without irony, that I believed in protecting people, especially when no one else thought you could. They looked at me a little longer after that one. When I got my conditional acceptance, I didn't celebrate. Just saved the email, printed a copy, and tucked it into a folder with my training documents. I'd met the first benchmark. The real work was just beginning. I started preparing for OCS on my own schedule, waking up before sunrise, running laps around the local park with a weighted vest, spending nights reviewing naval protocols and field manuals. Nobody saw it. Nobody knew. And that suited me just fine. A few weeks later, Pablo called me for the first time in months. Said he needed help reworking a report he was presenting to his superiors. I stayed up until 2 a.m. editing it, tightening his arguments, fixing formatting errors he hadn't even noticed. When I sent it back, he replied with a thumbs-up emoji. No words. No thanks. I didn't expect more. But something in me started to shift. I was tired. Not of helping, but of being erased. I was doing everything they said I couldn't, and still, it wasn't seen. Dad still talked about me like I was some lost liberal arts major with pipe dreams. Mom asked about my love life more than my goals. And Pablo. Pablo was the hero. Always had been. Always would be, as far as they were concerned. Except I had started building something they couldn't see. A record. A case file. A reputation, small, quiet, but growing. And I knew, eventually, there would be a day when the truth would come out in a way that couldn't be minimized or brushed aside. Maybe not now. Maybe not tomorrow. But someday. I didn't need them to believe in me anymore. I just needed them to witness it. Whether they liked it or not. Pablo's voice started changing not long after he got his academy acceptance. Not just deeper in tone, he'd already passed that stage, but heavier, like it carried authority now. When he talked, he paused like he expected people to listen. When he laughed, it was often at someone else's expense. Usually mine. He came home that first summer after initial training full of inside jokes and jargon, all sharp corners and certainty. Gone was the kid who used to play backyard tag with me until dusk. Now he moved like someone watching his own shadow, correcting my posture when I stood too casually and pointing out how I chewed my food too slow, like a civilian. He said it half joking, but the line between teasing and belittling blurred more with every visit. Dad encouraged it. I saw it in how his eyes lit up when Pablo recited procedures or quoted leadership manuals word for word. They spoke a private language now, acronyms, field terms, mutual contempt for inefficiency. I'd try to participate in conversations and get talked over, or worse, smiled at condescendingly like I was the well-meaning mascot of the family. Nat's got her little projects, Dad would say, gesturing vaguely toward me like I was some kind of pet inventor. What surprised me wasn't their bond, it had always been there. What surprised me was how eager Pablo seemed to weaponize it. He'd always known our dad treated us differently, but now he leaned into it like he'd earned the privilege. One afternoon, I was home helping Mom with errands when Pablo walked in mid-call with one of his academy friends. He put the phone on speaker and made a show of introducing me. "This is my sister," he said, patting my shoulder like I was an old dog. "She's got big dreams too. Probably gonna lead the yoga battalion someday." His friend laughed. I didn't. Mom gave a polite chuckle, but didn't say anything. And I stood there holding a bag of groceries, suddenly unsure what exactly I was doing in that house. Later that night, I overheard Pablo and Dad talking on the back deck. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but I was grabbing a glass of water and they were loud. Dad was asking if I was still messing around with that officer application, and Pablo replied, "She means well, but she's not like us." I stood there frozen, fingers wrapped around the cold tap. The words weren't cruel. They were worse, they were dismissive. Final. Like someone folding a chapter closed before I even got to write a sentence. The next morning, I left before breakfast and didn't come back until evening. No one noticed. I'd been quietly making progress. My conditional acceptance had moved to a confirmed slot pending physicals and final paperwork. I'd completed a Navy fitness test with solid scores across the board, and my background review came back clean. My assigned recruiter, Lieutenant Merrick, said he was impressed with how thorough I was. "You're probably more prepared than half the people who walk in here," he told me. Keep that up. But I didn't share any of it with my family. Not after that night. Pablo kept calling less. When he did, it was mostly for help, editing reports, finding data for his assignments, or reviewing emails before he sent them to commanding officers. He still never said thank you. When I mentioned I had interviews of my own coming up, he brushed it off. "Is that for that civilian track thing?" he asked once. "Good for you. That's more your speed anyway." More my speed. Like I was some volunteer mascot for national defense. Dad didn't do much better. At one point, I made the mistake of telling him I was going in for a final interview with a selection board. He didn't even look up from his paper. "You think they'll take you?" he asked flat. "Be serious, Nat. You're not a field type." "I'm not applying for infantry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's systems operations." "Strategy." "That's even worse," he muttered. "They don't want theorists. They want leaders." Mom told me later not to take it personally. "He just wants what's best for you. He worries." But I knew that tone. It wasn't worry. It was disbelief dressed in concern. A way of telling me I'd reached too far and should be grateful for the view I had. I doubled down. Woke up earlier, trained harder, revised every prep document until it was bulletproof. My roommate started noticing the hours I kept and asked if I was training for a triathlon. I told her I was training to prove someone wrong. "Damn," she said. "That's the most intense revenge plan I've ever heard." It wasn't revenge, not exactly. But it wasn't not that either. Pablo posted a picture around that time, standing in uniform at some award banquet, Dad beside him beaming like the proudest man on earth. The caption read, "Legacy in the making." He didn't tag me. He didn't even mention I was the one who'd helped him rewrite the speech he gave that night. When I saw the post, I just closed my laptop and went back to reviewing protocols. Let them have their legacy. I was building something different. One weekend that spring, Pablo came home for a quick visit. We were both in the kitchen again, a rare moment alone. I was slicing vegetables for dinner, and he leaned against the counter like he owned the place. "So," he said casually, "still chasing the Navy thing?" "I'm not chasing it," I said. "I'm doing it." He smirked. All right. Just don't expect it to be like what you've read. It's not a think piece. It's pressure. Real life." I looked at him and for the first time didn't feel anything. Not anger. Not jealousy. Just clarity. "I'm not scared of pressure," I said quietly. "Pressure's what made me apply." He didn't reply. Later that night, over dinner, Dad made some offhand joke about me being the liberal arts daughter trying to play soldier. Mom winced. Pablo laughed. I excused myself to take a call that didn't exist, stepped outside, and stood in the driveway for 10 full minutes, watching my breath rise in the cold. When I walked back in, no one asked where I'd been. They'd stopped seeing me a long time ago. And I had stopped waiting to be seen. I didn't tell anyone when the rejection came. It was for a direct entry program I'd spent months preparing for, one that would have fast-tracked me into systems command with a hybrid leadership path. I'd built the application from scratch, triple-checked every line, rehearsed the interview answers until I could say them in my sleep. And still, the email arrived on a Tuesday morning like a punch I saw coming too late. "Thank you for your interest." Due to the highly competitive nature of the program. I read it 3 times, once out loud. Then I closed the tab and stared at my reflection in the black screen. I didn't cry. I didn't tell my roommate. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I opened a new browser window and pulled up the alternate officer intake options, slower track, less visibility, but still legitimate. Still mine. I reapplied that same week. It was quieter the second time. Fewer essays, more technical screening. No fanfare, no input from anyone in my life. I kept it that way on purpose. By then, Pablo had been officially commissioned. His final officer ceremony was scheduled for the following month, and my parents were practically floating with anticipation. Mom ordered a custom frame for his commissioning certificate, and Dad dug out his dress blues from the back of the closet, just in case the old ones still fit. Every phone call, every text, every family dinner was a countdown to Pablo's moment. I considered skipping the ceremony. Not out of bitterness, exactly. Just exhaustion. But I knew what people would say if I didn't show, how they'd interpret it. So I put on a dress shirt, fixed my hair, and showed up at the base auditorium 15 minutes early. The room was already buzzing. Rows of stiff chairs lined in military precision, people shaking hands, laughing too loud, adjusting uniforms. Pablo stood near the front, spotless in his whites, surrounded by a cluster of peers and officers. He caught my eye briefly and gave me a half-smile before turning back to his conversation. I made my way toward the family section where Mom was already directing people into seats like she ran the event herself. "Nat, over here," she called, waving me forward like I was a guest they almost forgot to invite. I nodded and sat down quietly, folding my hands in my lap. Dad arrived a few minutes later, animated and flushed from whatever conversation he'd been having in the parking lot. "That's her," he said suddenly, gesturing toward me as he approached an older man in full uniform. "My daughter, the one who gave up on the Navy thing." I turned toward them slowly. I hadn't moved. I hadn't said a word. But somehow I still felt exposed. The man raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Dad clapped him on the back. "She had a little phase a while back. Thought she might follow the family tradition. But it didn't stick." I stood up. "Just enough to level the distance between us." "I didn't give up," I said, evenly. "I just didn't get in the first time." The man looked caught off guard but nodded politely. Dad laughed, too loud for the room. "It's okay, Nat," Pablo said from nearby, stepping into the conversation with a smirk. "Not everyone's cut out for it." The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was heavy. Long enough for me to see that no one was going to correct him. No one was going to stop and say, "That's not fair." I sat through the ceremony like someone watching a play from behind soundproof glass. Applause felt distant. Speeches blurred. Pablo's name was called, and everyone stood. Mom wiped tears from her cheeks. Dad stood taller than I'd ever seen him. I clapped because it was expected. Afterward, there were photos. I posed where I was told, smiled when the camera clicked. Pablo stood between our parents, beaming, while I held the edge of the frame like an afterthought. One of the officers shook my hand and said something generic, "Your family must be proud of both of you." I didn't correct him. When the crowd started to thin and the sun dipped behind the building, I made my way to my car. I'd parked at the far edge of the lot, away from the crowds. I climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door, and sat in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared straight ahead at the windshield and felt something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't heartbreak. That would have required surprise. This felt more like confirmation. Like hearing the words you already knew out loud for the first time. She gave up. Not everyone's cut out for it. That's what they believed. Maybe what they'd always believed. My phone buzzed once, an automated message from the recruitment office confirming receipt of my updated intake documents for the alternate path. I stared at the screen for a moment, then turned it face down on the passenger seat. It would be weeks before I got the results. Months before I started the next phase, assuming it went through. But I already knew that whatever came next, it wasn't going to be for them. Not anymore. They'd made it clear where I stood. What I lacked. What they expected from me, quiet support, no spotlight, no deviation from the script they'd written. But I wasn't going to play that part anymore. I wasn't even in the same story. So I sat there in the quiet, in the back lot of a celebration that was never mine, and let the silence harden into something solid. Not anger. Not revenge. Resolve. After Pablo's ceremony, I started pulling back. Not in a dramatic, burn the bridge kind of way, just quietly, steadily. I stopped initiating calls. Stopped showing up for dinners. When Dad forwarded me an article about Navy retention rates with a note that said, "This is what commitment looks like," I didn't reply. When Mom asked in the family group chat if I could help Pablo rewrite a grant proposal, I waited 3 days and then said I was swamped. Technically, none of that was untrue. I was deep in training by then, part of a less celebrated but still rigorous route into commissioned service. The kind that required you to prove yourself in silence. No photo ops. No framed certificates. Just relentless study, long drills, and instructors who never once asked who your father was or cared what your last name meant. I started working with an advisor assigned to my unit, Lieutenant Marissa Klein. She'd served 2 deployments in naval intelligence before moving into training and development. Sharp, dry sense of humor. No patience for ego. When I told her what had happened at the commissioning ceremony, she just blinked once and said, "Yeah, that sounds about right." We were sitting in a briefing room after a session on operations structure. Everyone else had left. I don't know what made me tell her, but I did. The whole thing. The way Dad had introduced me. What Pablo had said. How none of it had surprised me, and how that made it worse. "They don't think I belong here," I said finally. Lieutenant Klein leaned back in her chair, arms folded. "They don't need to," she said. "You just have to outlast the noise." She didn't offer a pep talk. No cliches about proving people wrong or turning pain into power. Just a simple truth. Belief isn't a requirement for progress. Endurance is. That stuck with me. I went home that night and opened a folder I hadn't touched since the first rejection. Inside were notes from that old application, marked up essays, printed rejection emails. I read every line. Not to punish myself, just to understand. To see clearly what I'd built since then. The gaps had closed. The weaknesses had hardened into strengths. My assessments were clean. My physical scores were above average. I was advancing, even if no one was clapping. And that was the night I stopped needing their encouragement. Up until then, I'd still been holding some space for it. Hoping they'd notice. That one day Dad might say, "I was wrong about you." That Pablo might text me something other than a question about formatting. But that night, I deleted the old family group chat from my phone and didn't look back. Pablo didn't notice I'd left. Mom texted once a week like clockwork, updates about the neighbors, whether a forwarded meme or quote that felt vaguely like an olive branch. I answered when I had the energy, which wasn't often. Dad didn't reach out at all. Instead, I filled my time with things that actually mattered. My coursework demanded discipline, precision, teamwork. I took on more field sim rotations than required and volunteered to lead group scenarios when others hesitated. Slowly, my name started getting mentioned in instructor briefings. I wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but I was consistent, reliable, calm under pressure. I listened more than I talked. When I spoke, people paid attention. Instructors noticed. So did peers. And somewhere along the way, I noticed too. One evening, Lieutenant Klein handed me back a strategy analysis I'd written. She tapped a line in the margin and said, "This is how leadership actually sounds. Measured. Clear. You should consider applying for unit lead in the next rotation." I stared at her for a second. "Seriously?" She nodded. "You've got the right mind for it. And more importantly, you're not performing for anyone. That's rare." It took me a moment to understand what she meant. Performing. For a long time, I had been trying to earn applause that wasn't coming. But now, I was doing the work for its own sake. Because it needed to be done. Because I could do it. I applied for the unit lead position the next day. Not out of ambition, exactly. Just readiness. When I got it, I didn't call home. Instead, I texted the one person who had never once needed convincing, my old high school calculus teacher, Ms. Patel. She'd written one of my first recommendation letters. When I told her the news, she sent back, "I knew you'd get there." Quiet persistence always wins in the end. I wrote that down. The next few months were a blur. Between leadership training, simulations, and coursework, I barely had time to think about anything else. And that was a gift. My world had narrowed to what I could control, what I could impact directly. No more proving. Just progress. Around that time, Pablo posted another update. He'd completed his first training milestone and had a photo taken with a senior officer. In the caption, he wrote, "Proud to follow in my father's footsteps." It runs in the blood. I didn't feel anything when I saw it. Not resentment. Not longing. Just a quiet confirmation we were walking different paths now. His needed to be recognized. Mine needed to be earned. A few days later, I ran into one of Pablo's former classmates during a joint training exercise. He recognized my last name and asked if I was related. He talked about you, the guy said. Said you were sharp but didn't want the structure. More of a civilian mindset. I didn't correct him. There was no point. After the drill, I sat with Lieutenant Klein for a debrief. She looked over my tactical reports and said, "You're the only one who didn't miss the redundancy in Phase 3. I shrugged. Just felt like the obvious backup. She smiled faintly. The ones who see what others miss, they're the ones who last. It was the closest thing to pride I'd heard in a long time. And it meant more than anything my family might have said. Back at my apartment that night, I made tea and sat with my notes, reviewing logistics for the next unit assignment. My calendar was full for the next 6 weeks, training ops, coursework deadlines, a mentorship rotation with Klein. All of it mine. None of it contingent on anyone's approval. I realized then that somewhere between rejection and progress, something inside me had shifted completely. I had stopped seeking a seat at their table and built my own. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about living in a space where their opinions no longer shaped the ceiling of my ambition. They hadn't changed, but I had, and that, more than anything, felt like freedom. I accepted my posting the same day I received the offer. There was no ceremony, no celebration, no group text. Just an official letter, a signed contract, and a quiet exhale that I'd earned something no one thought I would. The work wasn't glamorous, it rarely is in operations, but it was real. Complex logistics, systems assessments, situational planning across multi-branch teams. It required sharp thinking, relentless focus, and a tolerance for long hours with no margin for error. I didn't tell anyone at home. Not out of spite, just certainty. If they found out through someone else, so be it. I didn't need them in the loop anymore. They'd had their chance to see me. They chose not to. My first 3 months on base passed quickly. I passed all qualifying exams, top 5% in my division. My supervisor wrote a formal commendation, noting my exceptional ability to anticipate and mitigate logistical breakdowns under stress. I forwarded the email to Lieutenant Klein, who replied simply, "Told you." Outlast the noise. I kept working. I picked up additional assignments when others passed. I started mentoring junior officers who struggled with structure or sequencing. I wasn't the loudest, but I was dependable. Sharp. The kind of officer others asked for by name. 2 months later, Pablo sent a group message. It was the first time I'd heard from him directly since his commissioning. "Hey all, promotion ceremony next Saturday at 1400. Open to the public. Would love to see everyone there." It was short. No personal note. No direct mention of me. Just a blanket invitation to whoever was still interested. I stared at the message for a while. Then I marked it unread and went back to work. But the night before the ceremony, I laid out my uniform. Pressed. Clean. Formal. I didn't owe them a reaction, but I was no longer hiding either. The ceremony was held in a base auditorium 2 hours from where I was stationed. I arrived early, slipped in through the side entrance, and took a seat in the back row. I watched the crowd file in, extended family, old classmates, colleagues in uniform. My parents sat front and center, practically glowing. Mom in a navy dress. Dad in a jacket he only wore to weddings and promotion boards. No one recognized me. Pablo stood near the front, chatting with a superior officer. I hadn't seen him in person in almost a year. His posture was still perfect. His smile effortless. He was made for public moments like this. For applause. The ceremony started right on schedule. Formal. Predictable. His name was called and the crowd erupted in polite applause. Pablo walked confidently across the stage, accepted his new insignia, gave a short speech about duty, sacrifice, and family. There were a few light laughs. A warm finish. It could have been lifted straight from a handbook. Then came the closing remarks. The commanding officer stepped up to thank everyone for attending and, unexpectedly, acknowledge other officers present in the audience. And we're honored to have several distinguished personnel in attendance today, including Major Gutierrez, recently appointed to Systems Command, who's been instrumental in the integration work we're piloting this quarter. There was a pause. Heads turned. My row twisted around in confusion. I stood. And for the first time in my adult life, people looked at me the way they always looked at Pablo. Curious. Impressed. Attentive. The officer scanned the crowd and spotted me near the back. He stepped down from the stage, walked the length of the room with quiet precision, and extended his hand. "Major Gutierrez," he said. "It's an honor. I've read your work on redundancy path mapping. It's exceptional." His grip was firm, his tone sincere. I heard a chair shift in the front row. Dad's shoulders had gone rigid. Pablo's mouth was slightly open, his eyes locked on mine. He didn't blink, just stared. I didn't smile. I didn't explain. I nodded once, shook the officer's hand again, and sat back down. No one applauded. No one moved. For 10 full seconds, the room held its breath. Then the program resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. I felt it. So did they. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the adjoining hall. I debated leaving, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood off to the side near the coffee station, speaking briefly with 2 officers I'd worked with remotely. They hadn't known I was related to Pablo. I hadn't offered the information. 20 minutes in, I spotted my father weaving through the crowd toward me. He stopped a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back. "I didn't know," he said finally. "About your posting." I nodded. "That's because I didn't tell you." He opened his mouth to reply, then shut it again. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. "I read your name in a logistics brief last month," he admitted. "Didn't realize it was you. I assumed it was someone else." It wasn't. A pause. "You've done well," he said. There was no warmth in his voice. Just obligation. "Thanks." Pablo approached a minute later. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood beside Dad, shifting his weight. "You didn't say you were coming." "I wasn't sure I would," I said. His jaw clenched, then relaxed. "That officer, he knew your name. Like, really knew it. I've been working on his initiative for 6 months." He looked away for a second, then back. "I didn't realize you were that far in." I said nothing. He cleared his throat. "Congratulations." Seriously. It was the first real thing he'd said to me in over a year. "Thanks." I left before dessert. Walked out into the cold with my cover tucked under my arm and a strange kind of calm in my chest. Not triumph. Not vindication. Just clarity. They had seen it. Heard it. Felt it. And this time, they couldn't deny it. After the ceremony, things didn't explode. They shifted. Quietly, like the weight of the room had been rearranged. My name didn't come up in the family group chat, but the messages got shorter. My dad didn't send links to articles anymore. No forwarded motivational speeches, no snide remarks about real military service. Just silence, which, coming from him, was almost louder. Pablo texted me 3 days later. It wasn't a question. Just a sentence. "Didn't realize you were working with Major Kern's team." That's impressive. I stared at it for a full minute before replying. "Yeah, it's been demanding. Worth it, though." That was it. He followed up a week later. Asked what kind of operations I was focused on. Wanted to know if I'd read the new systems doctrine from Strategic Command. He wasn't smug about it. If anything, it sounded like someone trying to feel out a new language with someone they used to know. I answered politely. Short sentences. Clear tone. Nothing personal. It wasn't forgiveness. It was boundaries. He started forwarding me articles. Relevant ones. Smart ones. And when he asked for help editing a policy memo, he added, "Only if you have time." That was new. I helped him. Not because he earned it, but because I had the time. And because it cost me nothing now to be generous. The real surprise was Dad. He stopped talking over me the next time we were in the same room. It was at Mom's birthday dinner. Small group. Mostly family. I was seated across from him. He tried once, cut me off mid-sentence when I brought up a recent assignment. But then he caught himself. Or maybe noticed that everyone else had stopped talking too. I held my gaze steady, waited. He gestured for me to continue. I did. He didn't interrupt again. It wasn't warmth. Not even respect. It was confusion. Like someone trying to reconcile what they thought they knew with what had just happened in front of them. He didn't know how to talk to me anymore. And I didn't fill in the blanks for him. I kept things surface level at home. Work remained mine. I never offered details unless asked directly, and even then, I kept it tight. They'd lost the right to my full story. But what filled the space they left behind was clarity. Without their judgment, I got sharper, calmer. I stopped second-guessing every move. I took on more responsibility, tested out ideas I might have once held back. One of my supervisors asked if I'd considered putting together a policy proposal for operational redundancies across digital logistics. I had. I just hadn't told anyone. He encouraged me to write it out. 3 weeks later, it was accepted for internal review. 2 months after that, it was flagged for a cross-department pilot program. The lead systems analyst called it one of the most scalable submissions we've seen in the last year. I forwarded the summary to Lieutenant Klein with no commentary. She replied, "That's how it starts. Keep building." At work, I wasn't just performing, I was shaping systems. At home, I didn't need to explain that anymore. Pablo called one night after I'd been promoted to lead operations coordinator for a classified logistics integration project. It wasn't a big call. No announcements. No flattery. Just, "Hey, got a second?" We talked for 30 minutes. He asked good questions. Listened. Didn't make jokes at my expense. When I mentioned I was briefing a joint team the following week, he paused and said, "You really worked for this, huh?" "Yeah," I said. "I did." He was quiet for a second. "I never said it, but you made it look easy. And it's not." I didn't respond right away. "It wasn't supposed to be," I said finally. "But I didn't do it for them." "Yeah," he said again. "I get that now." The thing about being overlooked for so long is that once you stop craving recognition, you see how much power you were giving away. When you stop trying to be seen, you start seeing everything clearly. That clarity was the most valuable thing I'd gained. It changed how I approached everything: briefings, strategy sessions, collaborations. I didn't need to prove I belonged anymore. I belonged because I was there, doing the work no one else wanted to carry. And I did it well. There were challenges. Always. A few senior officers who didn't know what to make of me. A systems overhaul that failed the first time we piloted it, even though the projections had been solid. A colleague who tried to sideline me in a budget meeting until I pointed out the flaw in his numbers with my own math in front of everyone. But I stayed steady. Learned. Adjusted. Spoke when it mattered. My name started coming up in rooms I wasn't in yet. Promotions became conversations, not long shots. I stopped thinking of my career as a proving ground and started thinking of it as a platform. By the end of that year, I was selected to co-lead a task force testing integration protocols between Joint Force logistics units. It was one of the most complex operations I'd ever been part of. I was the only woman on the lead team. The only officer under 30. And no one questioned it, not once. Pablo and I crossed paths again that fall. We were both invited to a panel on interbranch cooperation. He gave a sharp presentation. I moderated a debriefing afterward. When he introduced me to one of his superiors, he didn't hesitate. "This is my sister," he said. "Major Gutierrez. She's one of the smartest logistical minds I know." The man smiled and said, "I've seen her work." Dad wasn't there to hear it. But I didn't need him to be. I was finally living in a space I built on my own terms, with none of the noise, none of the conditions. Just quiet, capable progress. And that, more than any speech or salute, was the transformation they never saw coming. It was months after the panel when Pablo called again. I hadn't expected to hear from him beyond the occasional forwarded article or surface-level check-in. But that night, my phone lit up with his name, not a message, a call. I debated letting it go to voicemail. But something told me to answer. "Hey," he said when I picked up. His voice was quieter than usual. "Hey." There was a pause. Then, "I've been meaning to say this for a while. I didn't realize how far you'd come. What you've built. I was wrong. About you." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't angry. I wasn't moved. I was just tired of being someone people apologize to too late. "Thanks," I said eventually. "But I'm not looking for that anymore." He let out a breath like he'd been holding it. "Yeah," I figured. The conversation lasted 10 more minutes. He asked about my new assignment. Told me he'd been rotated into a new unit with heavier responsibility. We talked about logistics platforms, not childhood. Protocol, not personal history. It was professional, neutral. Safe. We've spoken a few times since. Updates here and there. Articles sent without commentary. Short messages before holidays. Neither of us mentions the gap between us, and I don't think we ever will. The closeness we had when we were kids, the kind built on shared cereal boxes and late-night cartoons, never came back. Too much was left unsaid for too long. Too many assumptions unchallenged. But I don't need it anymore. I don't look at our conversations and ache for more. I accept them for what they're now. Two people who share a past and occasionally overlap in the present. That's enough. My dad, on the other hand, has never brought it up. Not the ceremony. Not my title. Not the commendations I've quietly accumulated. He speaks to me now with a formality that wasn't there before, measured, careful. Like he's afraid of saying the wrong thing. Or maybe of revealing how much he got wrong. Either way, we don't talk about the past. And we certainly don't talk about my work. There's no animosity. Just absence. And the absence doesn't bother me anymore. The last time we were all in the same room was at Mom's retirement dinner. She'd stepped down after 25 years of teaching and wanted a small gathering, just family, close friends, nothing elaborate. I arrived late, straight from a briefing, still in uniform. A few people glanced over when I walked in, and one of Mom's colleagues, who'd never met me, asked what branch I served in. When I told her, her eyes widened. "Oh, I had no idea," she said, glancing at my parents. "You must be so proud." Mom smiled. Dad just nodded and looked away. I sat across from Pablo that night. He asked a few questions about my current posting. I asked about his travel schedule. The conversation was smooth, like two professionals navigating a polite social event. We didn't reminisce. We didn't reach back. After dinner, while people were saying their goodbyes, Pablo lingered near the coat rack. "I meant what I said, you know," he told me as I slipped on my jacket. "I was wrong about you." "I think Dad knows it too. He just doesn't know how to say anything." "He doesn't have to," I said. "It's not his to fix." Pablo nodded, but he didn't look relieved. Just resigned. We walked out together and stood under the awning as the rain started. I watched the drops gather on the sidewalk. "You ever think we could have done it differently?" he asked quietly. "I think you could have," I said. "But that's not what happened." He didn't argue. We parted with a hug, brief, shoulder to shoulder, the kind you give someone you used to know better than you do now. On the drive home, I thought about what trust actually meant. For years, I'd treated it like something to earn back once it was broken. But maybe that was the wrong measure. Maybe trust wasn't about rebuilding something old. Maybe it was about recognizing what still stood after the damage. I trusted that Pablo understood now, that he carried some measure of awareness he hadn't before. And I trusted myself to never shrink again to fit their comfort. My dad didn't need to apologize. And I'd stopped waiting for him to. What came next didn't depend on whether they changed. It depended on what I chose to carry forward. And what I chose was peace. I'm still serving. Not in headlines. Not in glossy family newsletters. Just in the steady cadence of days filled with purpose, precision, and responsibility. I report in. I lead. I analyze, recommend, correct, improve. And when I leave the building at the end of each day, I don't carry the weight of needing anyone's permission to be proud of the work I've done. No one at home asks for updates. Not anymore. My name doesn't come up when they talk about the family legacy. At dinner tables and birthdays, Pablo's path is still the visible one, the one with familiar titles, recognizable milestones. And that's fine. I don't need them to understand the difference between prestige and impact. Between being the face of something and being the one quietly holding the frame together. I've stopped expecting questions. The kind that would mean they were really paying attention. What I remember instead is the look on that general's face when he crossed the room, hand extended, and said, "Major, it's an honor. I've read your work." There was no fanfare. No performance. Just recognition, grounded, deliberate, and real. That moment held more weight than anything I'd chased before it. Not because of who he was, but because of what it represented. I hadn't introduced myself that day. I hadn't corrected anyone. I hadn't needed to. My work had spoken first. It still does. And that, I've learned, is the kind of legacy that lasts. Not the one written in framed certificates or passed around in family stories, but the one that moves quietly through systems, operations, decisions, changing things without announcing itself. I still walk into rooms where I'm underestimated. Still sit at tables where the assumption is that I'm support staff or logistics assistant or somebody's plus one. And then I open the file. Or correct the plan. Or ask the question no one else thought to raise. And the room shifts. Every time that happens, I think back to the years I spent trying to earn a version of respect that was never built for me. How much of my early ambition was really about wanting to be seen, not for what I did, but for who I was trying to become. I don't move that way anymore. Now, I make choices based on alignment, not approval. Pablo and I still talk now and then. Professional things. Occasional messages with real weight behind them. He's steadier now, more thoughtful. I think the distance between us taught him something too. We were both shaped by the same house, the same expectations. But we were handed different rules, different roles. And for a long time, he never questioned that. Now he does. He even sent me a link last month, a podcast episode on leadership psychology, with a note that said, "Reminded me of something you said once." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And that's enough. Dad remains a fixture. Unchanged, mostly. He's softened around the edges, or maybe just gotten quieter. We don't talk about my work. But he doesn't challenge it either. And in some way, that silence has become its own kind of truce. Mom still tries to bridge the space between us all. She sends holiday invites and forwards family photos. Sometimes she includes little notes, "Saw this and thought of you." I always write back. Not out of duty, but because some relationships survive in fragments, and that's okay. I don't feel small in their presence anymore. I don't revert or explain or shrink to fit the version of me they once believed in. Because that version doesn't exist anymore. They called me a failure. Said I wasn't cut out for the life I chose. Doubted I had the grit, the resolve, the edge. For a while, I believed them. I measured myself against their scale and found myself lacking. But here's the truth no one tells you. Most people can't see past their own limitations. Their doubt was never about me. It was about the narrow path they were comfortable with. And I never fit inside that. So I built something else. There's a peace that comes when you no longer need to be proven right. When you're no longer waiting for someone to say, "You did it." When your name isn't followed by hesitation, but by a quiet, certain nod from people who've seen what you've done. I've worked under 3 commanding officers since that day. Every single one of them has come to me with the same tone when something urgent breaks. Not because I'm loud, but because I deliver. My team trusts me. My mentors respect me. And the systems I've helped build are still running. That's the legacy I care about. I'm not interested in being the loudest voice at the table. I'd rather be the one who rewrote the table's blueprint, so the whole system works better for whoever comes next. When people talk about success, they often mean visibility, titles, applause. But I've found that real success, the kind that holds up when no one's watching, lives in quieter places. In consistency. In clarity. In showing up fully without needing a spotlight. Sometimes, the best proof isn't a comeback. It's the calm that settles in when you realize you don't need one anymore. And that calm? That's what they never saw coming. Thanks for listening. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Or worked twice as hard just to be seen? Drop your story in the comments. I read every one. And if you've ever had to prove yourself quietly, without applause, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about setting boundaries and standing tall when it matters most. Sometimes the loudest revenge is peace.